Hello everyone, FishDen365 here. I'm glad you could be with me today. We're going to talk about a very important subject in fishing today, a subject that is getting more and more confusing as each year passes by. It's fishing line. You know, when you think about it, we spend a lot of money on our fishing reels and our rods and our baits, but sometimes we forget about the importance of fishing line. And it's very important because at the end of the day, it is your connection, your direct connection to the fish. So it's the line that ends up transmitting what's going on at the bottom of the lake between your lure and your fingers as you're retrieving a bait. So the line is very important, and this is one area where sometimes fishermen will skimp on line when it comes to what they buy. And this is something that is very important. If you're going to spend on the rod and the reel, make sure you buy a good quality fishing line. It's very important. After doing everything you can to catch a fish by having the right equipment, the right bait, the right rod, the right reel, the line is the direct connection to the fish. That's the thing that can fail and is the most likely thing that'll fail when you are hooking and trying to bring a fish in. So don't skimp on fishing line. It's important that you have very good quality line when you're out doing your fishing. Now there's all different types of line today. You can see I have several examples out here. And there is a time when I buy cheap line. This line here, for example, was $2. And this might have been about the same price, maybe even a little lower. There's a time and a place for cheap line. It's never going to be my direct contact to the fish, but I do use this, and I'll explain how I use it a little bit later in the video. Anytime I have a connection to the fish, I want to buy the best line that I can get. And so I'm the type of person that once I find something that I like, that I think works well for me, I stick with it until it is proven that something is better. And that's a recommendation I would have for you too. Don't have several different manufacturers of fishing line because they all are a little different and they'll feel a little different. They'll transmit what's happening at the end of your line differently, and if you're always using different lines, then you may be missing some fish because of the differences in the line. So find what you like and stick with it until something is proven better. That's my recommendation when it comes to fishing line, actually for anything in fishing, the tackle, the rods and reels, all those types of things. So the next part of understanding what I want to do with this is simplify how I use fishing line. I like to keep things simple, and my purpose of this video today is to help you simplify the use of your fishing line. I'm going to describe how I use line today, what types of line I use, why I use what I use, and we're going to talk about the pros and cons of some of the different types of line. So today there's so many lines out there. There's monofilament, which has been around for many, many years. There's braided line. There's fluorocarbon line. There's polymer lines, copolymer lines. There's oval shaped lines, round shaped lines. It just goes on and on and on. And then there's hybrid type lines. So there's so many choices today, it can get to be confusing. Again, the purpose of this video is to simplify how one sets up their rigs with line and how they can go about fishing with confidence, knowing that they're doing the right thing, using the right line for the technique or situation that they're faced with. Let's start by showing you some of the different fishing outfits, rods and reels, that require line. Okay, first up we have a fly rod and fly reel. And so this is a specialized piece of equipment. It's different from all the other rods and reels, bait casters, spinning rods, spin casters, in that in those rods, the weight of the lure, the weight of the bait that you're throwing is what loads the rod and allows you to cast that bait. But in a fly rod like this, it's actually the weight of the line that's loading this rod. And so you're not casting the bait's not what's loading this rod, it's actually the line. And so you're casting with the weight of the line. So we're going to not focus on the fly rod in this discussion. It is a great way of catching bass, but it's its own discussion. You can create an entire video just to the lines and how to apply the lines to fly rods. There's all different types of tapers and that kind of thing. That's another discussion. So, but I did want to show it because this is a legitimate technique for catching bass, fly fishing. It's just different in the way the rod gets loaded than with the other techniques. Okay, the next outfit that we have here is a Spincast outfit. And so this is a Spincast reel. It is designed to sit on top of the rod like this, like a baitcaster would. A Spincast, actually the line goes on this reel the same way it would go on a spin reel. It goes around on a spool this way. The spool is facing out this way and the line goes around like this. And it has this closed face on it, which is supposed to help prevent tangles and that kind of thing. This is a great rod and outfit for kids just starting out with fishing. Generally, it's not high-end equipment. You can get this very cheaply, but the price you pay for that is that it does not perform as well as a bait casting outfit or a spinning outfit. For line on this, I would recommend using a monofilament line to fill these reels up, somewhere between 6 and 10 pound test, 8 pound test being perfect for an outfit like this. Monofilament is the appropriate line to put on here, and you want to pick out a good monofilament line. It should be a high quality. One that I recommend is Trilene, Berkeley Trilene XL. XL means extra limp, and that's important to have a limp line on a reel like this. I'll explain that when we get into spinning reels and a little bit with bait casters. Okay, now we're getting into the equipment that most bass fishermen use. This one is a bait caster. You can see the spool is configured differently than on a spinning reel. Here's an ultralight spinning reel, and the spool is set up differently for each one of these. So bait casters are good for lures that are a 1/4 ounce or higher in weight, and bait casters are very good for placing a bait accurately somewhere in a specific location. They're good for pitching and flipping techniques, and they're good for casting heavier baits very accurately. So that's the bait caster, and we'll talk about how line applies to this in a minute. Put that down here. And then the spinning reel. This is an ultralight reel. It's a small spinning reel. Excellent for anything a 1/4 ounce or below. So spinning rods excel where you have lighter baits, and you can cast these lighter baits longer distances with this type of reel than you can with a bait caster. This one's an ultralight reel. You can see I have this real tiny trout lure on here. It's great for streams. It's a little Rapala that my dad hand painted, and this thing's a little killer. Great for trout and panfish too. Okay, back to the discussion about fishing line. So today I've gotten to the point where I use braided line for all of my applications. Braided line for bait casters and braided line for spinning reels. Now, braided line has changed and improved over the years. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, braided line had some problems. It wasn't very abrasion resistant, and so if you were dragging that line over rocks, it would break quite easily. It just couldn't take that. They've made dramatic improvements since then, and the advantages that you get for using braided line now are just too many for me not to use it. I like to use it on all my reels. Now, I won't just stop there. Oftentimes I will use a leader with that braided line. A leader that will be either fluorocarbon or monofilament based on the application. So let's get into that a little bit. So just about braided lines first. I use anywhere from 10 pound test braided line all the way up to 50 pound test braided line depending on the application. Let's start with the high end, the 50 pound test. So there are applications where I need a heavy bait casting rod and reel because I'm fishing in heavy weeds. It's what I call slop, specifically topwater type of slop. So you have milfoil, matted vegetation, lily pads, and other types of weeds. What I'll do with that situation is I will use a straight braid, and it'll be 50 pound test. Well, let me show you. So here's an application where I would use just straight braided line on the reel, tied directly to the bait. In this case, it's a topwater toad that I'll use for fishing in weeds and heavy vegetation. And one of the things I like to do when I'm using braid, I like to use bright colored braid most of the time. Now, and the reason for that is you can see it. So if I'm fishing jigs or soft plastics, worms, that type of thing, if I buy a bright yellow line, I can see that line and detect when I'm getting a bite much better than if I was using a camouflage line or a dark green line, something like that. So depending on the application that I'm using, I'll usually use a brighter line that I can see. There are times where I will not. I like to use a camouflage braided line when I'm fishing crankbaits or jerkbaits because I don't need to see the line for that. I know when I'm getting bit on those type of techniques and applications. For the topwater toad, there's times when I actually fish this under the water and let it sink, and so when I do that, I want to be able to see the line. But what I do is I'll take a green marker and I'll color the first 3 to 4 feet of the line with the green marker. What you can do is you can take a knife and just put a little incision in the marker, and then you could put that on the line and just color your line dark green. That'll camouflage it a little bit. It just gives you a little more confidence when you're fishing in clear water with heavy vegetation. But what I find is that as long as the vegetation is quite thick, the fish are not line shy. I don't think they even know it exists when there's a lot of heavy cover around, and you can just fish this right in the heavy cover directly to the 50-pound test braid. And that's what I'll do with toads and topwater frogs and rats and that type of thing. You can also use a brown marker or a black marker. Any dark color like that will work fine for camouflaging your line. Now there's one main reason why I don't like to put a leader on this type of application. I'm fishing heavy vegetation. So no matter how good you are at tying a small knot to connect your leader to your braid, that has a tendency to pick up stuff, weeds that are floating on the surface. And so that'll kind of disrupt your presentation sometimes. So that's why I prefer not to have a leader with the braided line when I'm fishing vegetation, real heavy topwater vegetation. It makes me more efficient. I can fish more effectively this way and waste a whole lot less time shedding weeds off that knot. So why do I like braided line so much for all of my applications, bait casting and spinning reels? Braided line has some very unique properties that monofilament and fluorocarbon does not have. Number one, braided line has practically zero stretch. Compare that to monofilament. Monofilament has something like 20% stretch on a lot of the brands. So when a line like braid has no stretch like that, it becomes much more sensitive. You can feel so much more through that line than you would with a line that has stretch in it. So by not having that stretch, you get the great advantage of greater sensitivity to feel what's going on at the end of your line. The other big advantage of braid is that it is extremely limp. It basically has no memory. Now, what is memory? Memory is when a line will take a set. So a line coming off of this Baitcaster, for example, you can see it doesn't come off in coils. The braid on here is just straight. If I had monofilament line on there for a period of time, when it comes off it would be coiled. That's memory. It takes a set for the shape that it's been in for a long period of time. And that happens even more in spinning reels. Because of the way the spool is configured, you have that memory that can take place. And that's what makes fishing straight fluorocarbon line difficult, because it is stiffer and it does have more memory. And so if you're fishing a spinning reel application and you're using a fluorocarbon line, you're much more likely to get that ball effect, that ball of line coming off the reel, especially if you overfill the reel. And if you're using a heavier pound test, it's more likely to happen that way. But with braided line, that's very less likely to happen because the line has no memory. It's very limp. It just lays on there very smoothly. Those are the two main reasons why I like braid. And once I started fishing braid, the more I fished it, the more I loved it. It just gave me more advantages to feeling the fish, casting farther with it, casting more smoothly with it. Just made me a much more efficient and effective fisher. So right now I'm going to show you a little hack here on how to take line off of your reel. So let's assume you've got line that's worn out and it's time to change it. Now when I'm fishing braided line, that's another great thing about braid. It holds up and lasts longer than monofilament and fluorocarbon. And so, you know, you can get at least a whole year worth out of one spool of braided line, one filled spool. And then you can get a second year out of that by reversing the spool. So all you would do is put that braided line on a different reel, and now you're going to have the old line on the bottom part of the reel, and the fresher line that's at the bottom part of this reel now will now be at the top. So you can get a good 2 years, and this is heavily used now too. I mean, if you're not fishing very often, you can make it last much longer still. But I use my stuff quite heavily, and I can get about 2 years use out of my fishing line, out of my braided fishing line, before I have to replace it entirely. But let me show you a quick way to take the line off. So I have here a little power drill and a toilet paper roll, and you could also use a paper towel roll. Works the same way. Just put it on there, and I'm going to just wrap the line around here a few times. Engage the spool. Okay, you can see that takes it off very quickly, much faster than I can do if I was just pulling it off by hand. Just makes things a little bit simpler and easier to deal with. So now I'm going to just cut that line. And you could reuse this several times before I have one that's filled with a ton of line, so it's kind of nice. And then when you're ready, you can throw it away. It holds the line there for you very nicely. And a little hack there for you to take your line off your reels. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that cheap fishing line that I mentioned earlier in the video. If you notice, I still have line on the reel here. And the reason for that is I'm a frugal fisherman. I don't like to spend excess money if I don't have to. And so I always put what I call a backing on my reel first. Now if you're using braided line and you try and tie the braided line to the spool without using a backing, oftentimes you can't do it. It'll slip. And even if you're able to get that line to spool up, it could slip off. So it's always best to have some backing on there. And that's where this cheap line comes in. $2 line here, $1.50 line here. I'll put just a little bit of that backing on the reel spool first. And then I will tie a knot to the braided line, and then I'll spool the braided line on. And I'm going to show you specifically how I do that. I do something very specific with my braided line. I spool on every time 75 yards of braided line. Now, the reason why I chose 75 yards is I can't cast any farther than that. That's a very long way. It's a little extra than what I can cast. And so 75 yards or 225 feet is what I put on. And so if I have a 300 yard spool, then I can get four spool fills on a 300 yard spool like this one. So this one will give me 4 reel fills. And so this is how I determine how much line I put on. 75 yards, whether it's a bait caster. Now there are some reels that might not be able to fit that much on. Like if you have a very small ultralight spinning reel, you might have to go with less than that. But when you're fishing ultralight spinning reels, you're not casting that far anyway. But by far and large, for bass fishing, when they're larger spool reels, 75 yards is what I put on. 225 feet. How do I know it's 225 feet? I'll show you. So what I have here is a line counter. It's made by Berkeley. You can get these at Bass Pro Shops or other tackle stores. And this line counter mounts to your rod. So you just clip it on here. Just gotta laugh at myself sometimes, folks. So you sorry, you put it on and tighten it up, and then your line just goes through here. You flip this in the locked down position, and then you know how much line you're putting on your reel. The counter will count it up for you. 225 feet is what I like to do. Now, when we're putting line on a bait caster like this, this is important. You want to make sure the line goes on this spool in a certain way. So it needs to come off of this spool in the same direction as this one. So you do not want the line coming off the spool in this orientation. You want it coming off the spool in this orientation so that it can go directly on here. That prevents tangles. Now it's just the opposite with a spinning reel, so we'll show that to you in a few minutes. But let's continue with what we're doing on this particular setup, and then we'll move forward. So for ease of displaying here, I'm going to take this off. And so what I do next, basically I tie 3 knots in fishing, and one of those knots I hardly ever use, only when I need to. So almost 95% of the time I'm tying 2 knots. One of those knots is to connect my lines together, 2 different types of lines like braid and mono, or braid and fluoro. And the other knot is to tie my bait to the end of my line. Now that knot is always a palomar knot, and there's a right way and a wrong way to tie the palomar. So if you've ever had a palomar knot fail on you, in other words, it broke when it shouldn't have, I can show you how to prevent that. And I'm going to show you how to tie this knot. And I haven't seen many people tie the knot this way in videos that I've watched. But I went to a seminar that Shaw Grigsby had years ago, and he was having some trouble with the palomar knot, and he learned a way to tie it to make it so that it doesn't fail, and I'm going to share that with you in a few minutes. The other knot that I use is a uni to uni knot, or a double uni knot, and that's to attach my lines. And I'll show you what I do with that next, because we're going to be wanting to put some line on this reel. So we'll show you what we do there. I'm going to show you what I do to make this connection using a uni to uni knot. So this is the backing on the spool to my braided line. So what you'll need for this is a scissors, and I like to use a cup of water to wet the knot. Some people just like to slobber all over their line. For me, I just rather use a cup of water if it's available. So here's what I'll do. Hopefully you can see this. If you can't see this well, there's a ton of videos on how to tie the uni to uni knot. I don't do it any differently than anybody else. So in this particular case, I am going to tie a very simple uni to uni. I'm only going to use 2 loops, because this backing is never going to see the light of day unless I have a gigantic 40-pound striper on that ends up spooling me. But for my bass fishing applications, 2 loops is all I'll need. So I'll put up the mono side here, 1 loop, 2 loop, and then on the braided side, 1 loop, I like to use my mouth sometimes as a third hand. So there's my uni to uni, 2 loops each side. Dip that in the water, and I just go ahead and cinch that up, pull it together, and that's plenty of strength for what I want to do here. If it slips a little bit, it's not going to matter, because it's never going to come down there. And I do clip these tag ends off very close to the knot. Again, this knot, I'm not looking for strength here. It's more about speed and a very small knot. The smaller the knot, the better, because I just don't want that lump in the spool. So now I'm ready to spool this line. And I'll show you this uni to uni a second time when I tie my leader to this, because I tie that uni with 5 loops each, and I do something to strengthen the knot. So we'll show you that in a little bit. So you might be wondering, what pound test do I use for my backing? It really doesn't matter as long as it's not too thick, because the thicker the line, in other words, the larger diameter line, is just a little less wielding and a little more difficult to work with. It's wiry, it has more memory. So generally I'll put 10 pound test as my backing, just cheap 10 pound test monofilament line, and that's the backing that I'll use. And I've come to know about just how much backing to put on before I put on my 225 feet of braid, because I don't want to overfill or underfill my spool. Generally what you want is to have about 1/8 of an inch, a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch of space between the top of your spool and the fishing line. If you have it less than a 1/16 of an inch, in other words, if you fill your spool too much, then you tend to have problems with casting. More backlashes are likely to happen, or more tangles, especially with a spinning rod. But it can happen also with a bait caster. So that's another tip. If you're casting and having trouble and getting a lot of backlashes, and no matter how you set your reel, no matter what you do with the tension control knob or your magnetic brakes or your centrifugal brakes, and you're getting these kind of backlashes on your bait casters, you may have your spool overfilled. And if you're getting tangles coming off your spinning reel, same thing. So a 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch of space between the top of the spool and where the line comes up to that, between the line and the top of the spool. So now we're going to show you how I spool this up, and I wish I could tell you that I have a spooling station all ready to go, but I don't. But it's okay, because I am a human spooling station, and I'll show you how I do it in just a few minutes. I hope you get a kick out of it. I know my family does, but it works, and I can spool reels up quite quickly anywhere I am. I don't have to have a vise holding my spool or anything like that, because I'm a human spool filling machine. And I'll show you in a few seconds. Okay folks, this is what I do. So I put my line into my spool counter here. I'm going to lock it in place, make sure it's locked in there, and it is. I usually like to hold the rod at an angle like this. I tighten my spool control knob a bit so that it goes on there tightly, and I'll just begin to spool it on. Counting up right now. I'm going to go to 225, and then I'm going to cut it off. Turns out that was the last 225 feet on that spool. So we're ready to go. Now folks, if I was loading a spinning reel with line, I would do it differently because of the way it goes onto the spool. So with a spinning reel, I would lay a spool of line on the ground like so. I'd make my connection to my backing on my reel. I would stand up, I'd use my line counter, and I would reel in the line like this. So the way it comes off this spool is the way it goes on this spool here. That's important so that it doesn't get twisted and tangled. If it gets a lot of twist to it, then when you go to cast, you're going to have a mess. So that's the difference with spooling on for a spinning reel versus a bait caster. Now as you're spooling this line on, if you begin to notice that it starts to twist, then what you want to do is just flip the spool over and continue reeling on, and reeling the line on, and you'll notice that twist starts to go away. With braided line, it's much less of an issue than with monofilament or with fluorocarbon. If you're using either one of those lines, twist becomes a bigger issue more quickly. But because this braided line is very limp, doesn't have a lot of memory, usually goes on very nicely. So this particular rod and reel that I just filled, I usually like to use this rod for topwater techniques, also for spinner baiting, jerk baiting, and sometimes I'll use it for a square bill crankbait. And so if you're wondering what pound test I'm using of the braid here, it's 20 pound braid. And I did not mention what brand I like to use. So the braided line that I prefer to use is Spider Wire Stealth. I found it to be very good performing braid. It has a coating on it and it casts very well. I can cast very far with it. It holds up well. I have no reason to change it. Now, there's a ton of good braided line manufacturers on the market today. Power Pro, Suffolk makes good braided line. I just continue to use what I know works best for me. So for me, that today is Stealth. And until I find something better, that's what I'll continue to use. 20-pound test here. This has the diameter of 6-pound test, equivalent to 6-pound test if it was monofilament. So that's another advantage about braided line that I failed to mention earlier, and that is that it is a very small diameter line for its weight strength. So this is 20-pound test line, but it has a diameter of 6-pound test in monofilament. So another great advantage of it, which is why you can cast farther with it too. It's limp and it's a smaller diameter, so you can just cast further with it. I find that the baits that I like to use perform better with it when I'm fishing because of that smaller diameter. So it's just helped my fishing tremendously. So a little more general information about what line to use when. So you already know I like to use braided line in every application. So what's the next applications? When do I use a fluorocarbon leader versus a monofilament leader? So it's pretty simple. Monofilament floats. So anytime I'm using a top water technique, then I will use a monofilament leader. The other application I like to use monofilament for is when I'm using a Carolina rig. Now a Carolina rig, as you know, is you have a weight at the front end and your bait trails behind it. And so by having that monofilament line trailing behind it, sometimes that bait will ride off the bottom a little bit. So I want to get that bait trailing behind it. It's going to come down to the bottom and get dragged along there, but having monofilament will allow it to rise off the bottom a little bit now and then, and that could be helpful. So those are the two applications where I will use monofilament. And a lot of times it's 17-pound test for a lot of my top water applications when I'm using a walk the dog type bait or even a popper type of bait. And I like to use 17-pound test when I'm throwing a Carolina rig also, unless I'm fishing very clear water, and then I'll go down to a lower pound test. So there's the monofilament and why I use it. It's a floating line and it works better for those applications. Now I like fluorocarbon for applications where I want my line to sink. So if I'm using a crankbait, spinnerbait, jerkbait, all of those types of baits I like to use fluorocarbon for. Also, fluorocarbon has very nearly the same light refraction as water itself, so it is very nearly invisible underwater. So when I'm using a finesse presentation in very clear water, I want to make sure I'm using fluorocarbon line. Sometimes it can be down to 6-pound test, even 4-pound under certain applications. Most of the time though, I use 8-pound test fluoro. So for monofilament line, I like to use something called Berkeley Max. Now, they came out with this probably 10 years ago or so, and I bought a ton of it because I really liked it. Berkeley Trilene is a very good line. They have two major types. They have XL, which stands for extra limp, and they have XT, which is extra tough, abrasion resistant line. Some time ago they came out with Berkeley Max, which was supposed to be a blend of both the best properties of XT and the best properties of XL. And I'm still using Berkeley Max because I bought a lot of it. The problem now is I don't see it anymore in the stores. It doesn't seem to be available anymore. And I'm sure Berkeley Trilene has something that's replaced it. So if you're out there and you know what's replaced Trilene Max, please comment and let me know, because I'd love to know what's replaced this line, because I really like the Berkeley Trilene Max line. So, and this is 17-pound test here, and it's in a nice green color, so it's camouflaged very well. Now on my fluorocarbon lines, when I'm fishing a drop shot, I like to use this Cigar Invisex line as a leader. It's a little more limp than another line that I like from Cigar, which is Blue Label. This Blue Label line is incredible stuff. It's expensive, but it is extremely good line. It's very consistent, and it's probably the best line that I fish with overall. But it doesn't apply itself as good to certain techniques as the Invisex. So when I'm using light line presentations like a drop shot, I like to use this line. If I'm fishing small jigs, grubs, that type of thing, again, I'll use the Invisex. But when I'm pitching and flipping in heavy cover, so this might be pitching creature baits or a beaver or a jig in heavier cover, then I use Blue Label, and I typically use 20-pound test in that kind of cover. Unless the water is very clear, then I'll go to the lightest line I can get away with. But for good stained water, 20-pound test, Seaguar Blue Label, great fluorocarbon line. It's a great leader to use for those applications. Okay, what we're going to do next is tie our fluorocarbon leader to our braided line. And so for this particular application, I'm going to put on 8-pound test Seaguar Invisex. And this application is specifically for fishing some jerk baits. And by using the 8-pound fluorocarbon, I can get these jerk baits down a little bit deeper. So these are like pointer 100s, hard jerk baits, that application. Okay, so this is where things start to get interesting with why I do what I do here. So this is kind of important, and so watch what I'm doing with this particular knot. So again, I'm going to use a uni to uni to attach my leader to my line. And the first thing I usually do is pull off a complete arm's length of leader. So this is just putting my arms out, my hands out, shoulder to shoulder, and that's going to be the length of my leader. So I'm going to prepare that leader now and cut it off here. We'll get the spool out of the way. And so here's the leader that I have to work with. So the first important item here is that I want my leader to be the tag end of my leader on the right side and the tag end of my braid on the left side. And the reason for that is because I'm going to tie a uni to uni, and the tag end is going to stick out a little bit. But if I put the leader on the right side, the tag end will stick out in such a way where it's sticking out to the back. So the line will come through my guides much easier. It won't get hung up by that tag end sticking out. So always when you're tying the uni to uni, make sure that you have the leader side on the right side, on the right hand side. So I'm going to do 5 loops with this leader. This is a basic uni to uni knot. I'm using 5 loops now. I'm using 20-pound test braid, which is the spider wire stealth braid, and I'm using 8-pound test fluorocarbon, which is the Seaguar Invisex. Okay, so I have my 5 loops on the right side here with my fluoro leader, and now I'm going to tie 5 loops on the braided side. So here we go. I use my mouth to help. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now I've got my loops ready to go. Hopefully you can see that clearly. Again, I've got my cup of water here. I'm going to dip them in there and get them good and wet. I'm going to cinch it so that the braid side cinches all the way down, and I'm going to cinch it so that the leader side goes almost all the way down, but not quite. So I'm going to put that fluorocarbon leader, the tag end, in my mouth, in my teeth, and I'm going to cinch this down. And pull tight. Notice I didn't pull the tag end very hard. I don't want to tighten that tag end on the leader just yet. I want to make sure the knot is in the right shape. So I hold the tag end so it doesn't slip, and then I finish the knot off. So now I've got a good strong knot. I can tighten the tag ends. And you always want to inspect your knot when you're done tying it. You want those loops in this. This is very hard to see because this is very light line, 8-pound test. But you want the loops to be one right after another. You don't want loops cutting over one another. If they cut over one another, they're going to cut into each other, and the line will break much easier. So, but I have this one tied perfectly. Hopefully you can see that very well. I got my camera angle right here. I'm going to change the angle a few times just to make sure that you can see it. So now I'm ready to cut the tag ends off. So I'm going to leave just a little bit of tag end on each side, just a tiny hair, just to allow for some slipping. And we're going to do the same thing on the braided side. Okay, so we got our tag ends cut. And now if you'll notice, one thing I'll always do is I'll just kind of press down on the tag end on the leader side. And so if you notice that tag end sticking out slightly, but it's going in this direction, and that's how you want it to go because it'll go through your guides this way and it won't hang up. And there's one other thing that I do that helps in a number of ways. So, and what I do is I take some head cement. This is for tying flies. It's just fly tying head cement, and I like to put a little bit of that on this knot. And what that does is it strengthens the knot because it gets onto the knot and hardens over it, and it also creates less friction as the knot is going through the guides, so the knot will last longer as I'm casting through the guides. So I do this just to, when I'm tying ahead of time before a fishing trip, this is something I always do. Now if I'm tying on the water, I don't bother because if I break my line and I need to retie a line, I'll just retie on the water and not worry about this. But when I can prepare ahead of time, I like to put this head cement on there. It just makes the knot last that much longer. It protects it a little bit better, and it helps it slide through the guides a little better too. So I'd get a toothpick, dip it in here. Now this stuff is starting to get a little gooey because it's starting to get it's starting to cure a bit. And then I just put a little bit on the knot, try and get it all along there, and it dries very quickly. And I found that it does not harm the line. There's no chemical reaction on the braid or on the fluoro or even on mono. It holds up real well, and it just gives me a little bit more confidence in the knot, and also allows me to cast a little more smoothly. So that's my knot. After putting that on, in about 2 minutes, that'll be, or actually in about 20 seconds, that'll be dry and ready to go. And so the next knot I'm going to show you is the palomar knot, and I have a specific way of tying that also to make sure that it doesn't fail. Next up, I want to show you how to tie a palomar knot. But before I do, I thought I might talk a little bit more about that uni to uni. You may be wondering why I chose 5 loops. I've just found that for my applications, 5 loops works best. And I tie a uni to uni knot from braid that is high in pound test, is 50-pound test, down to 10-pound test braid. And the leader that I'm tying it to could be anywhere from generally 6-pound test all the way up to 20-pound test. And I found that for all of those applications, 5 loops for me works the best. Anything less than that, and you may be sacrificing some knot strength. If you go higher than 5 loops, what I found for myself, like I was trying 7 loops, 6 loops, and at 7 loops, what was beginning to happen was the line was overlapping itself and cutting into itself, and sometimes it would fail. The knot would break on me when I didn't want it to. So now I've been doing these knots for a long time, and I can tell you that I don't get failures on my knots. The only time my line is breaking is when I want it to break, and usually that is if I have a lure that's stuck on the bottom of the lake somewhere and I couldn't get it off and it's time to break it. But so it's important that that your knots are just as effective. The palomar knot, which I'm going to show you next, it's got an effective strength of like 98 or 99%. What that means is the knot is 98 or 99%, is, if you tie it right, as strong as the line itself. So anytime you tie a knot, you're weakening the line, no matter what that knot is. you're weakening the line somewhat. And some knots are better than others when it comes to their knot strength. The palomar knot is one of the best, and so that's what I'm going to show you next. Now, I was going to show you me tying it to a jerk bait, but instead and that was only 8-pound test, so instead I'm going to use 20-pound test and just tie it to this hook. But the way I tie the knot is the same. So let me show you now how I tie a palomar knot, and I learned this again from Shaw Grigsby, and I think it's a fantastic way to tie it. Now, when I am tying it to a hook like this, I do like to pass the knot through this side of the hook first, the point side of the hook first, rather than this way. And the reason for that is I found that when I tie the knot to a hook like this and I start by putting the line through in this orientation, that the knot comes off that hook straighter, which is important for your for your retrieves and your applications. So the first thing that we're going to do is make sure that we have enough line to do the knot with. And so you want 6 inches or so of line for a hook this size is good. And we're just going to double that line and pass it through the eye of the hook side first. So you can see I'm passing it through here. And then it's a very simple knot to tie. Then we're going to tie one overhand knot. So there's my overhand knot. Now comes the critical part, and the part where I tie differently than most others. So we're going to pass the hook through the loop. That part is the same as every other palomar tied out there. Now, what most people do here is they just wet the knot and cinch it down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the part of the knot, the key part of the knot, up the line. So all I did was I pulled the tag end and the knot part further up so that it's on the top end of this loop. It's the same palomar as always, but I have this up here. And it's a simple thing to do, but it's extremely critical so that the knot won't fail. The next step is to wet the knot, and I'm going to put my fingers through the loop here, and I'm going to just pull them together so that I get this knot coming together up top here. So I pull it together. I've got the knot has come together here on top, and now I'm going to take the tag end and the main line and just cinch it down real hard, real tight. And I'll make sure the tag end is tight and the main line is tight, and then I would cut my tag end off. Usually I'll leave maybe an 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch. It's not going to cause any harm. And there's my knot. So now, if you notice, it comes straight off the hook perfectly, and it's an extremely strong knot. And if you tie it the way I showed you, if you make that loop go right up the knot and cinch that down a little bit first and then ride it down, it'll never fail. The palomar knot sometimes fails if you don't do that because it'll cut over itself. Even if you wet it, it can cut into itself a little bit, and once in a blue moon, it'll fail. But if you tie it the way I just did, it will never fail. It's a very, very strong knot, and I've been tying it that way for years, and it's a great knot. Thanks to Shaw Grigsby for showing me that tip. Folks, I want to show that palomar knot once again from a different angle so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. So again, we're taking 6 inches of line here, approximately. Going to pass that line through the eye. Hook point side first. Got it through there. We're going to tie an overhand knot. Next, we're going to pass that hook through the loop. Here comes the critical part, folks. We're going to pull that part of the knot up the line. So I got the tag end here. I got the knot where I want it. I'm going to get it wet. I'm going to put my fingers through the bottom end here, and I'm just going to cinch that together. And then tag end and main line together, pull it tight. And there's my knot. That will not fail. It is incredibly strong. I think the hook would break in this case before that knot fails. That's it. Well, that concludes my tutorial on fishing line. I try and keep my approach as simple as possible. That's why I've chosen knots that are easy to tie but still very effective and that have very strong knot strength. Palomar knot, easy to tie, very strong. Uni to uni knot, it's become easy for me to tie. I think it's easier than some other knots. I know there are other knots with greater knot strength for joining lines, like the Albright knot. But for me, the uni to uni is simpler to tie, and I have had great success with it and no failures. So I'll continue to use that knot until one day I find something better for me. And so if you know a knot that's very good, like an Albright knot, and you're good at tying it, don't change. If it works for you, I'm not suggesting that you change anything. But if you're having some difficulty, or if you're looking for an easy knot or easier knots to tie, then hopefully this video will help. And I sure hope the video helps with breaking down fishing lines, what their good properties are, what the pros and cons are of those lines, and how to best utilize the assets of each line to improve your fishing. There's a ton of good information on the internet regarding knots these days, so I will try and put a few of those links in the description. And I will also show you a book that I found to be very good. This one is called Practical Fishing Knots. It's written by Lefty Kreh and Mark Sosin, and it's a very good book about knots. It has all the basic knots in it: blood knot, Palomar knot, surgeon's knot, bimini twist, Albright knot. They're all in here. So this is an excellent book. If you like reading books or going through books rather than being online, I would suggest picking up this one by Mark Sosin and Lefty Kreh. Very good book. So folks, if you've liked what you've seen here today, please subscribe to my channel and hit that like button. By subscribing and hitting the like button, you help me to produce more videos, and I certainly enjoy bringing them to you, and I hope to bring more very soon. My goal is to have one video released each week, hopefully more. And so check back often and see what we're up to next. May God bless your fishing endeavors.